Okay, we have two more readings in this section. John Hospers is going to give us a piece bringing in a sort of a new idea, free will and psychoanalysis from that perspective. And we're going to be discussing Schlick again. Schlick's analysis is indeed clarifying and helpful to those who have fallen victim to the confusions he exposes. And this probably includes most persons in their philosophical growing pains. But is this the end of the matter? Is it true that all acts, though caused, are free as long as they are not compelled in the sense which he specifies? May it not be that, while the identification of free with uncompelled is acceptable, the area of compelled acts is vastly greater than he or most other philosophers have ever suspected. Sit. Moore is more cautious in this respect than Schlick. While for Moore, an act is free if it is voluntary in the sense specified above, he thinks there may be another sense in which human beings and human acts are not free at all. We remember statements about human beings being pawns of their early environment, victims of conditions beyond their control, the result of causal influences stemming from their parents and the like. And we ponder and ask, still, are we really free? Is there not something in what generations of sagas have said about man being fettered? Is there not perhaps something too facile, too sleight of hand in Schlick's cutting of the Gordian knot? For example, when a metropolitan newspaper headlines an article with the words, "Boy killer is doomed long before he is born," and then goes on to describe how a 12-year-old boy has been sentenced to prison for the murder of a girl, and how his parental background includes records of drunkenness, divorce, social maladjustment, and paresis, are we still to say that his act, though voluntary and assuredly not done at the point of a gun, is free? The boy has early displayed a tendency towards sadistic activity to hide an underlying masochism and prove that he's a man. Being coddled by his mother only worsens this tendency until, spurned by a girl in his attempt on her, he kills her. Not simply in a fit of anger, but calculatedly, deliberately. He is free in respect of his criminal act, or for that matter, in most of the acts of his life. Is he free in respect of his criminal act, or for that matter, in most of the acts of his life? Surely to ask this question is to answer it in the negative. Perhaps I have taken an extreme case, but it is only to show the superficiality of the Schlick analysis the more clearly. Though not everyone has criminotic tendencies, everyone has been molded by influences which in large measure at least determine his present behavior. He is literally the product of these influences stemming from periods prior to his years of discretion, giving him a host of character traits that he cannot change now, even if he would. So obviously, does what a man is depend upon how a man comes to be. So obviously does what a man is depend upon how a man comes to be, that it is small wonder that philosophers and sages have considered man far indeed from being the master of his fate. It is not as if man's will were standing high and serene above the flux of events that have molded him. It is itself caught up in this flux, itself carried along on the current. An act is free when it is determined by the man's character, say moralists. And what if The most decisive aspects of his character were already irrevocably acquired before he could do anything to mold them. What if even the degree of willpower available to him in shaping his habits and disciplining himself now to overcome the influence of his early environment is a factor over which he has no control? What are we to say of this kind of freedom? Is it not rather like the freedom of the machine to stamp labels on cans when it has been devised for just that purpose? Some machines can do so more efficiently than others, but only because they have been better constructed. It is not my purpose here to establish this thesis in general, but only in one specific respect which has received comparatively little attention, namely the field referred to by psychiatrists as that of unconscious motivation. In what follows, I shall restrict my attention to it because it illustrates as clearly as anything the points I wish to make. Let me try to summarize very briefly the psychoanalytic doctrine on this point. The conscious life of the human being, including the conscious decisions and volitions, is merely a mouthpiece for the unconscious, not directly for the enactment of unconscious drives, but of the compromise between unconscious drives and unconscious reproaches. There is a big three behind the scenes, which the automaton called the conscious personality carries out. The id, an eternal gimme, presents its wish and demands its immediate satisfaction. The superego says no to the wish immediately upon presentation, and the unconscious ego, the mediator between the two, tries to keep peace by means of compromise. To go into examples of the functioning of these three bosses would be endless. Psychoanalytic case books supply hundreds of them. The important point for us to see in the present context is that it is the unconscious that determines what the conscious impulse and the conscious actions shall be. Hamlet, for example, had a strong Oedipus wish, which was violently counteracted by superego reproaches. These early wishes were vividly revived in an unusual adult situation in which his uncle usurped the coveted position from Hamlet's father and won his mother besides. This situation evoked strong strictures on the part of Hamlet's superego, and it was this that was responsible for his notorious delay in killing his uncle. A dozen times, Hamlet could have killed Claudius easily, but every time Hamlet decided not to. A free choice, moralists would say. But no, listen to the superego. What you feel such hatred toward your uncle for, what you are plotting to kill him for, is precisely the crime which you yourself desired to commit. To kill your father and replace him in the affections of your mother. Your fate and your uncle's are bound up together. This paralyzes Hamlet into inaction. Consciously, all he knows is that he is unable to act. This conscious inability he rationalizes, giving a different excuse each time. We have always been conscious of the fact that we are not masters of our fate in every respect, that there are many things which we cannot do, that nature is more powerful than we are, that we cannot disobey laws without danger of reprisals, etc. We have become officially conscious too, though in our private lives we must long have been aware of it, that we are not free with respect to the emotions that we feel, whom we love or hate, what types we admire, and the like. More lately, still, we have been reminded that there are unconscious motivations for our basic attractions and repulsions, our compulsive actions and inabilities to act. But what is not welcome news is that our very acts of volition and the entire train of deliberations leading up to them are but facades for the expression of unconscious wishes, or rather, unconscious compromises and defenses. A man is faced by a choice, Shall he kill another person or not? Moralists would say, here is a free choice, the result of deliberation and action consciously entered into. And yet, though the agent himself does not know it and has no awareness of the forces that are at work within him, his choice is already determined for him. His conscious will is only an instrument, a slave in the hands of a deep unconscious motivation that determines his action. If he has a great deal of what the analyst calls free-floating guilt, he will not. But if the guilt is such as to demand immediate absorption in the form of self-damaging behavior, this accumulated guilt will have to be discharged in some criminal action. The man himself does not know what the inner clockwork is. He is like the hands on the clock, thinking they move freely over the face of the clock. A woman has married and divorced several husbands. Now she is faced with a choice for the next marriage. Shall she marry Mr. A or Mr. B, or nobody at all? She may take considerable time to decide this question, and her decision may appear as a final triumph of her free will. Let us assume that A is a normal, well-adjusted, kind, and generous man, while B is a leech and impostor, one who will become entangled constantly in quarrels with her. If she belongs to a certain classifiable psychological type, she will inevitably choose B, and she will do so even if her previous husbands have resembled B, so that one would think that she had learned from experience, unquote. Consciously, she will, of course, give the matter due consideration, etc., etc. To the psychoanalyst, all this is irrelevant chaff in the wind, only a camouflage for the inner workings about which she knows nothing consciously. If she is of a certain kind of masochistic strain, as exhibited in her previous set of symptoms, she must choose B. Her superego, always out to maximize the torment in the situation, seeing what dazzling possibilities for self-damaging behavior are promised by the choice of B, compels her to make the choice she does, and even to conceal the real basis of the choice behind an elaborate facade of rationalizations. A man has wash compulsion. He must be constantly washing his hands. He uses up perhaps 400 towels a day. Asked why he does this, he says, I need to. My hands are dirty. And if it is pointed out to him that they are not really dirty, he says, they feel dirty anyway. I feel better when I wash them. So once again, he washes them. He freely decides every time. He feels that he must wash them. He deliberates for a moment, perhaps, but always ends by washing them. What he does not see, of course, are the inevitable wires inside him pulling him inevitably to do the thing he does. The infantile id wish concerns preoccupation with dirt. The superego charges him with this, and the terrified ego must respond, no, I don't like dirt. See how clean I like to be? Look how I wash my hands. Let us see what further free acts the same patient engages in. This is an actual case history. He is taken to a concentration camp and given the worst of treatment by the Nazi guards. In the camp, he no longer chooses to be clean, does not even try to be. On the contrary, his choice is now to wallow in filth as much as he can. All he is aware of now is a disinclination to be clean, and every time he must choose, he chooses not to be. Behind the scenes, however, another drama is being enacted. The superego, perceiving that enough torment is being administered from outside, can afford to cease pressing its charges in the quarter. The outside world is doing the torturing now. So the superego is relieved of the responsibility. Thus, the ego is relieved of the agony of constantly making terrified replies in the form of washing to prove that the superego is wrong. The defense no longer being needed, the person slides back into what is his natural predilection anyway, for filth. This becomes too much even for the Nazi guards. They take hold of him one day, saying, we'll teach you how to be clean, drag him into the snow, and pour bucket after bucket of icy water over him until he freezes to death. Let us take a less colorful, more everyday example. A student at a university possessing wealth, charm, and all that is usually considered essential to popularity begins to develop the following personality pattern. Although well taught in the graces of social conversation, he always makes a faux pas somewhere, and always in the worst possible situation. To his friends, he makes cutting remarks which hurt deeply, and always apparently aimed in such a way as to hurt the most. A remark that would not hurt A, but would hurt B, he invariably makes to B rather than to A, and so on. None of this is conscious. Ordinarily, he is considerate of people, but he contrives always, unconsciously, to impose on just those friends who would resent it most, and at just the times when he should know that he should not impose. At 3 o'clock in the morning, without forewarning, he phones a friend in a nearby city demanding to stay at his apartment for the weekend. Naturally, the friend is offended, but the person himself is not aware that he has provoked the grievance. Common sense suffers a temporary eclipse. A temporary eclipse when the neurotic pattern sets in, and one's intelligence, far from being of help in such a situation, is used in the interest of the neurosis. And when the friend is cool to him the next time they meet, he wonders why and feels unjustly treated. Aggressive behavior on his part invites resentment and aggression in turn. But all that he consciously sees is others' behavior towards him. And he considers himself the innocent victim of an unjust persecution. Each of these acts is, from the moralist's point of view, free. He chose to phone his friend at 3 a.m. He chose to make the cutting remark that he did, etc. What he does not know is that an ineradicable masochistic pattern has set in. His unconscious is far more shrewd and clever than is his conscious intellect. It sees with uncanny accuracy just what kind of behavior will damage him most, and unerringly forces him into that behavior. Consciously, the student doesn't know why he did it. He gives different reasons at different times. But they are all, once again, rationalizations cloaking the unconscious mechanism which propels him willy-nilly into actions that his common sense eschews. The more of this sort of thing one observes, the more he can see. The more one can see what the psychoanalyst means when he talks about the illusion of freedom. And the more of a psychiatrist one becomes, the more one is overcome with a sense of what an illusion this free will can be. In some kinds of cases, most of us can see it already. It takes no psychiatrist to look at the epileptic and sigh. It takes no psychiatrist to look at the epileptic and sigh with sadness at the thought that soon this person before you will be as one possessed, not the same thoughtful, intelligent person you knew. But people are not aware of this in other contexts. For example, when they express surprise at how a person to whom they have been so good could treat them so badly. Let us suppose that you help a person financially or morally in some other way, so that he is in your debt. Suppose further who unconsciously identify kindness with weakness and aggression with strength. Then he will unconsciously take your kindness to him as weakness and use it as the occasion for enacting some aggression against you. He can't help it. He may regret it himself later. Still, he will be driven to do it. If we gain a little knowledge of psychiatry, we can look at him with pity, that a person otherwise so worthy should be so unreliable. But we will exercise realism too, and be aware that there are some types of people that you cannot be good to. In free acts of their conscious volition, they will use your own goodness against you, free in quotes. Sometimes the persons themselves will become dimly aware that something behind the scenes is determining their behavior. The divorcee will sometimes view herself with detachment, as if she were some machine, and indeed, the psychoanalyst does call her a repeating machine. I know I'm caught in a net, that I'll fall in love with this guy and marry him, and the whole ridiculous merry-go-round will start all over again. We talk about free will. And we say, for example, the person is free to do so and so, if he can do so, if he wants to. And we forget that his wanting to is itself caught up in the stream of determinism, that unconscious forces drive him into the wanting or not wanting to do the thing in question. The analogy of the puppet whose motions are manipulated from behind by invisible wires, or better still, by springs inside, is a telling one at almost every point. And the glaring fact is that it all started so early, before we knew what was happening. The personality structure is inelastic after the age of 5, and comparatively so in most cases after the age of 3. Whether one acquires a neurosis or not is determined by that age, and just as involuntarily as if it had been a curse of God. Only the psychiatrist knows what puppets people really are. And it is no wonder that the protestations of philosophers that the act which is the result of a volition, a deliberation, a conscious decision is free, leave these persons, to speak mildly, somewhat cold. Now, what of the notion of responsibility? What happens to it in our analysis? Let us begin with an example, not a fictitious one. A woman and her 2-year-old baby are riding on a train to Montreal in midwinter. The child is ill. The woman wants badly to get to her destination. She is, unknown to herself, the victim of a neurotic conflict whose nature is irrelevant here, except for the fact that it forces her to behave aggressively toward the child, partly to spite her husband, whom she despises and who loves the child, but chiefly to ward off superego charges of masochistic attachment. Consciously, she loves the child, and when she says this, she says it sincerely. But she must behave aggressively toward it nevertheless, just as many children love their mothers but are nasty to them most of the time in neurotic pseudo-aggression. The child becomes more ill as the train approaches Montreal. The heating system of the train is not working, and the conductor pleads with the woman to get off the train at the next town and get the child to a hospital at once. The woman refuses. Soon after, the child's condition worsens, and the mother does all she can to keep it alive without, however, leaving the train, for she declares that it is absolutely necessary that she reach her destination. But before she gets there, the child is dead. After that, of course, the mother grieves, blames herself, weeps hysterically, and joins the church to gain surcease from the guilt that constantly overwhelms her when she thinks of how her aggressive behavior has killed her child. Was she responsible for her deed? In ordinary life, after making a mistake, we say, chalk it up to experience. Here we would say, chalk it up to the neurosis. She could not help it if her neurosis forced her to act this way. She didn't even know what was going on behind the scenes. Her conscious self merely acted out its assigned part. This is far more true than is generally realized. Criminal actions in general are not actions for which their agents are responsible. The agents are passive, not active. They are victims of a neurotic conflict. Their very hyperactivity is unconsciously determined. To say this is, of course, not to say that we should not punish criminals. Clearly, for our own protection, we must remove them from our midst so that they can no longer molest and endanger organized society. And of course, if we use the word responsible in such a way that justly to hold someone responsible for a deed is by definition identical with being justified in punishing him, then we can and do hold people responsible. But this is like the sense of free, in which free acts are voluntary ones. It does not go deep enough. In a deeper sense, we cannot hold the person responsible. We can hold his neurosis responsible, but he is not responsible for his neurosis, particularly since the age at which its onset was inevitable was an age before he could even speak. The neurosis is responsible. But isn't the neurosis a part of him? We have been speaking all the time as if the person and his unconscious were two separate beings, but isn't he one personality, including conscious and unconscious departments together? I do not wish to deny this, but it hardly helps us here. For what people want when they talk about freedom, and what they hold to when they champion it, is the idea that the conscious will is the master of their destiny. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And they surely mean their conscious selves, the self that they can recognize and search and introspect. Between an unconscious that willy-nilly determines your actions and an external force that pushes you, there is little, if anything, to choose. The unconscious is just as if it were an outside force. And indeed, psychiatrists will assert that the inner Hitler, your superego, can torment you far more than any external Hitler can. Thus, the kind of freedom that people want, the only kind they will settle for, is precisely the kind that psychiatry says that they cannot have. Heretofore, it was pretty generally thought that, while we could not rightly blame a person for the color of his eyes or the morality of his parents, or even for what he did at the age of 3, or to a large extent what impulses he had and whom he fell in love with, one could do so for other of his adult activities, particularly the acts he performed voluntarily and with premeditation. Later, this attitude was shaken. Many voluntary acts came to be recognized many voluntary acts came to be recognized, at least in some circles, as compelled by the unconscious. Some philosophers recognize this too. Ayer talks about the kleptomaniac being unfree and about a person being unfree when another person exerts a habitual ascendancy over his personality. But this is as far as he goes. The usual examples, such as the kleptomaniac and the schizophrenic, apparently satisfy most philosophers, and with these exceptions removed, the rest of mankind is permitted to wander in the vast and alluring fields of freedom and responsibility. So far, the inroads upon freedom left the vast majority of humanity untouched. They began to hit home when psychiatrists began to realize, though philosophers did not, that the domination of the conscious by the unconscious extended not merely to a few exceptional individuals, but to all human beings, that the big three behind the scenes are not respecters of persons and dominate us all, even including that sanctum sanctorum of freedom, our conscious will. To be sure, the domination by the unconscious in the sense of normal individuals is somewhat more benevolent than the tyranny and despotism exercised in neurotic cases, and therefore the former have evoked less comment. But the principle remains in all cases the same. The unconscious is the master of every fate and the captain of every soul. We speak of a machine turning out good products most of the time, but every once in a while it turns out a lemon. We do not, of course, hold the product responsible for this. But the machine, and via the machine, its maker, it is silly to extend to inanimate objects the idea of responsibility. Is it silly to extend to inanimate objects the idea of responsibility? Of course. But is it any less so to employ the notion in speaking of human creatures? Are not the two kinds of cases analogous in countless important ways? Occasionally, a child turns out badly too. Even when his environment and training are the same as that of his brothers and sisters who turn out all right, he is the bad penny. His acts of rebellion against parental discipline in adult life are traceable to early experiences of real or fancied denial of infantile wishes. Sometimes the denial has been real, though many denials are absolutely necessary if the child is to grow up to observe the common decencies of civilized life. Sometimes, if the child has an unusual quantity of narcissism, every event that occurs is interpreted by him as a denial of his wishes, and nothing a parent could do, even granting every humanly possible wish, would help. In any event, the latter neurosis can be attributed to this. Can the person himself be held responsible? Hardly. If he engages in activities which are a menace to society, he must be put into prison, of course, but responsibility is another matter. The time when the events occurred, which rendered his neurotic behavior inevitable, was a time long before he was capable of thought and decision. As an adult, he is a victim of a world he never made. Only this world is inside him. I'm going to keep the inflection on that because I think that's what he's really saying anyway. What about the children who turn out all right? All we can say is that it's just lucky for them. That what happened to their unfortunate brother didn't happen to them. Through no virtue of their own, they are not doomed to the life of unconscious guilt, expiation, conscious depression, terrified ego gestures of the appeasement for a tyrannical superego that he is. The machine turned them out with a minimum of damage. But if the brother cannot be blamed for his evils, neither can they be praised for their good, unless, of course, we should blame people for what is not their fault and praise them for lucky accidents. We all agree that machines turn out lemons. We all agree that nature turns out misfits in the realm of biology. The blind, the crippled, the diseased. But we hesitate to include the realm of the personality, for here, it seems, is the last retreat of our dignity as human beings. Our ego can endure anything but this. This island, at least, must remain above the encroaching flood. But may not precisely the same analysis be made here also? Nature turns out psychological lemons too, in far greater quantities than any other kind, and indeed all of us are lemons in some respect or other, the difference being one of degree. Some of us are lucky enough not to have criminotic tendencies, or masochistic mother attachment, or overdimensional repetition compulsion to make our lives miserable. But most of our actions, those usually considered the most important, are unconsciously dominated just the same. And if a neurosis may be likened to a curse of God, let those of us, the elect, who are enabled to enjoy this measure, to enjoy a measure of life's happiness without the hellfire of neurotic guilt, take this not as our own achievement, but simply for what it is, a gift of God. Let us, however, quit metaphysics and put the situation schematically in the form of a deductive argument. 1. An occurrence over which we had no control is something we cannot be held responsible for. 2. Events E, occurring during our babyhood, were events over which we had no control. 3. Therefore, events E were events which we cannot be held responsible for. 4. But if there is something we cannot be held responsible for, neither can we be held responsible for something that inevitably results from it. 5. Events E have as inevitable consequences neurosis N, which in turn has an inevitable consequence behavior B. Since N is the inevitable consequence of E and B is the inevitable consequence of N, B is the inevitable consequence of E, says 6. 7. Hence, not being responsible for E, we cannot be responsible for B. In Samuel Butler's utopian satire, Erewhon, there occurs the following passage in which a judge is passing sentence on a prisoner. It is all very well for you to say that you came of unhealthy parents and had a severe accident in your childhood which permanently undermined your constitution. Excuses such as these are the ordinary refuge of the criminal, but they cannot for one moment be listened to by the ear of justice. I am not here to enter upon curious metaphysical questions as to the origin of this or that, questions to which there would be no end were their introduction once tolerated, and which would result in throwing the only guilt on the tissues of the primordial cell or on the elementary gases. There is no question of how you came to be wicked, but only this, namely, that you are wicked, that are you wicked or not? This has been decided in the affirmative. Neither can I hesitate for a single moment to say that it has been decided justly. You are a bad and dangerous person, and stand branded in the eyes of your fellow countrymen with one of the most heinous known offenses. End quote. As moralists read this passage, they may perhaps nod with approval, but the joke is on them. The sting comes when we realize that the crime is for which when we realize what the crime is for which the prisoner is being sentenced, namely, consumption. The defendant is reminded that during the previous year he was sentenced for abbreviated bronchitis and is warned that he should profit from experience in the future. Butler is employing here his familiar method of presenting some human tendency, in this case holding people responsible for what isn't their fault, to a ridiculous extreme and thereby reducing it to absurdity. Assuming the main conclusions of this paper to be true, is there any room left for freedom? This, of course, all depends on what we mean by freedom. When free means uncompelled, excuse me, and only external compulsion is admitted, there are countless free acts. But now we have extended the notion of compulsion to include determination by unconscious forces. With this sense in mind, our question is, with the concept of compulsion thus extended and in the light of present psychoanalytic knowledge, is there any freedom left in human behavior? If practicing psychoanalysts were asked this question, there is little doubt what their answer would be, that their answer would be along the lines of, what their answer would be along the following. If practicing psychoanalysts were asked this question, there is little doubt that their answer would be along the following lines. They would say that they were not accustomed to using the term free at all, but that if they had to suggest a criterion for distinguishing the free from the unfree, they would say that a person's freedom is dependent in inverse proportion to his neuroticism. In other words, the more his acts are determined by a malevolent unconscious, the less free he is. Thus, they would speak of degrees of freedom. They would say that as a person is cured of his neuroses, he becomes more free. free to realize capabilities that were blocked by the neurotic affliction. The psychologically well-adjusted individual is in this sense comparatively the most free. Indeed, those who are cured of mental disorders are sometimes said to have regained their freedom. They are free from the tyranny of a malevolent unconscious, which formerly exerted as much of a dominion over them as if they had been the abject slaves of a cruel dictator. But suppose one says that a person is free only to the extent that his acts are not unconsciously determined at all. Be the unconscious benevolent or malevolent? If this is the criterion, psychoanalysts would say most human behavior cannot be called free at all. Our impulses and volitions having to do with our basic attitudes towards life. Whether we are optimists or pessimists, tough-minded or tender-minded, whether our tempers are quick or slow, whether we are naturally self-seeking or naturally benevolent, and all the acts consequent upon these things, what things annoy us, whether we take to blondes or brunettes, old or young, whether we become philosophers or artists or businessmen, all this has its basis in the unconscious. If people generally call most acts free, it is not because they believe that compelled acts should be called free. It is rather through not knowing how large a portion of our acts are actually compelled. Only the comparatively vanilla-flavored aspects of our lives, such as our behavior towards people who don't really matter to us, are exempted from this rule. These, I think, are the two principal criteria for distinguishing freedom from the lack of it, which we might set up on the basis of psychoanalytic knowledge. Conceivably, we might set up others. In every case, of course, it remains trivially true that it all depends on how we choose to use the word. The facts are what they are, regardless of what words we choose for labeling them. And if we choose to label them in a way which is not in accord with what human beings, however vaguely, have long had in mind in applying these labels, as we would be doing if we labeled as free many acts which we know as much about how we now many acts which we know as much about as we now do through modern psychoanalytic methods, then we shall only be manipulating words to mislead our fellow creatures. Right. We will discuss this on Tuesday evening.